You're an unusual man, Mr. Berg. You speak 7 languages. You're an athlete. You're more than up to the physical requirements of the job.
What job?
Since this war began, we have reason to believe the Germans are working on a fission bomb.
The scientist leading the atomic program is Werner Heisenberg. We must get to him and find out how close the Germans are to a bomb.
Welcome to the OSS, Mr. Berg. Millions of lives at stake. A 5% chance of losing the war to a weapon like this, you do what has to be done. You can't allow yourself to be captured.
You know that I love you.
You brought me here to say goodbye?
I'll be back. Is this your first job? I've never killed a man, if that's what you mean. It's not as hard as you might think.
I don't know what God you believe in, Berg, if any. But I'll be asking mine to keep an eye on you.
What if Heisenberg is on our side? Are you hoping he'll defect?
If it comes down to it, are you going to be able to kill him? There may be one moment that tells you whether the Germans have a bomb. One moment when you'll learn all you need to know.
Don't move.
Welcome, friends. I'm so glad that you've joined us here today. We're going to be speaking about a really remarkable figure named Moe Berg, who was a Major League Baseball player and a spy for the US government during World War II. We're graced with the presence of the author of this book, The Catcher Was a Spy, The Mysterious Life of Moe Berg, Nicholas Dawidoff. He has written this and several other books, including his biographical memoir of his grandfather called The Fly Swatter, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His articles appear in the New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine, and the feature film, The Catcher Was a Spy, was based on his book. Interviewing Nicholas will be Jacob Goldstein, who's an executive producer at Pushkin Industries, an independent podcast company. Previously, he spent more than a decade as co-host on the Planet Money podcast of National Public Radio, so you've probably heard his voice. He has done stories for the New York Times Magazine, This American Life, Morning Edition, and All Things Considered. Nicholas, welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me. Let me tell you a little bit about Moe Berg. Moe Berg was the son of immigrants from an area of what is now Ukraine. At various times, it was Russia or Poland, as probably many of you know. His father decided that the family should leave the village, the shtetl where they lived, and come to the United States because they wanted to have a secular existence. His father found it oppressive to be living in a community that was dominated by religion. He came to the Lower East Side of New York. While he was working in a laundry, he was simultaneously studying to be a pharmacist. Moe Berg grew up living above a pharmacy in Newark, New Jersey. His father worked basically all the time downstairs. Moe Berg was from the first, like his father, very, very gifted with languages. And he was someone who from the first lived a dual existence, kind of in the way that his father's studying foreshadowed, which is to say that he was a little boy who loved baseball and played as much baseball as he could. And he was a very gifted student who had a precocious affinity for foreign languages.
Did you mention, Nikki, in the book, do I recall correctly, that his father never once went to see him play baseball?
His father didn't go to see him play baseball. When they published in the newspaper that people who were named, for example, to the bar, he'd become a lawyer. He practiced almost not at all, but he went to Columbia Law School and became a lawyer basically for his father. And so when it's published in the newspaper that he's passed the bar exam, in response, he doesn't hear from father. So he calls up his father and he says, Father, I passed the bar. And his father says, I read the newspapers, and he hung up. I mean, it's that kind of thing. He played baseball throughout his childhood, and he briefly attended New York University, which he never talked about in his Moe Berg way. He was often very secretive about aspects of his life. But then he went to Princeton, which he talked about a lot, which is a very significant thing to him. And he, at Princeton, was a student of languages. He was near the top of his class. And by his senior year, he became one of the best baseball players in Princeton history. With his second base partner, they exchanged communication in Latin, thus making Yale and Harvard players unable to understand what they were talking about. He was a wonderful student of languages, and he loved playing baseball, and he continued both careers ever after. As a graduate, he went to New York City to play for the Brooklyn professional baseball team. There were a great many recent Jewish immigrants to New York, many of whom were baseball fans. Baseball was a wonderful way for immigrants generally to assimilate into the United States. And New York teams, no New York team had a great Jewish player, and there was always the aspiration among management to have a Jewish star on their team, and there was competition for Berg. He signed with the Brooklyn team, played there for a little while. He didn't play very well. Then his career toggled between minor league teams. He at first was a shortstop, and then he eventually became a catcher when he was a member of the Chicago White Sox. This is a much more appropriate position for somebody like Moe Berg, because the catcher is the one person who faces the field, determines strategy, works with pitchers as sort of a conduit to thinking through the dimensions of the game. All of this, the sort of giving of signs, which is a baseball language, was all interesting to Berg. Moe Berg makes 2 trips to Japan. In 1932, he goes to Japan to help teach young Japanese athletes. He teach them the more sophisticated aspects of baseball. It's sort of a goodwill tour. And then in 1934, he goes back with an all-star team. There's Babe Ruth, there's Lou Gehrig, there are many players of great American fame. And then there's Moe Berg, who's added to the roster at the last minute. While he's there, he becomes even more immersed than he had been in 1932 in Japanese culture. As you can see from the photograph, he makes friends. He develops a lifelong liking for wearing kimonos. He also wears gaita on his feet. A very significant moment in Moe Berg's history happens when he goes to a hospital, which is a particularly tall building in the center of Tokyo. And he's ostensibly going to meet the daughter of the American ambassador who's had a child. But he has a bouquet. He's going to see her, but he doesn't stop at her floor. He goes up to the roof. He makes a series of panning films, less than a minute, but quite a few images of Japanese, at least industrial buildings and the Tokyo harbor and so forth. And later on, it's believed that by some people, that these films become become the planning basis for the Doolittle raids of Tokyo, but that turns out to be not true. But he did make these films. The films it was a somewhat dangerous and inventive thing to do. Not everybody would think of doing that, going to the top of a building in Japan at a time when the country is increasingly building towards war, when people have great suspicion of foreigners, and secretively making films. And then he shows them to people in Washington at the beginning of the war, but we can tell that by the time he's showing them to people, the Doolittle raids have already happened. Moe Berg became very close to one of the most prominent columnists, who is John Kieran of the New York Times. With John Kieran, whenever John Kieran was dry for a column, he would get in touch with Berg. They would sit there and he would ask Berg a series of questions, and then there would be another installment in these sort of columns about the great Professor Berg. Berg loved the baseball player's life of moving from town to town. In the short hours that a ball player worked, left much time for Berg to go to museums, go to lectures by people like the Thomas Mann expert in that community or something. And so he enjoyed the company of baseball players, but nobody ever really knew him that well. They found him mysterious. He always wore a gray suit, a black tie, and a white shirt. He had a fetish with his newspapers where he read many of them every day. Nobody could touch the newspaper he was going to read eighth in the day, even though he was reading the first one, because if you touched it, he wasn't going to read it. If your hand came near, he'd say, "It's alive, it's alive." And generally, he was a compelling, somewhat mysterious and restrained, very respected member of the baseball community. And then after baseball, he continued to play and then to coach. After baseball, he went to Latin America during the beginnings of the Second World War, where he worked for Nelson Rockefeller as a sort of roving goodwill ambassador, and also someone who took it upon himself to find out about things. This was not really a theater of war, but there was potential for war to be there. And Berg was always someone who wanted to know things that he wasn't supposed to know. And so he was constantly sending back to Rockefeller all sorts of lengthy dispatches on things that were going on. He later, after this, joins the Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA. For the Office of Strategic Services, he first had a desk job, and then he had his most prominent assignment, which is he became the OSS operative charged with trying to determine whether or not there was a German atomic bomb program, whether, in other words, Nazi-affiliated physicists and engineers were building an atomic bomb for Adolf Hitler. This, as you can imagine, was something of enormous consequence, and he did his job very well. One of his achievements during the Second World War was to become immersed in a very close-knit group of people who are the great physicists of their time. After Italy was liberated, he consulted with several Italian physicists, but the person he became closest to was Paul Scherrer, who is a much beloved, among other physicists, Swiss physicist, who became sort of a very secretively, he was, because you couldn't compromise Swiss neutrality, he became a sort of a conduit through Berg to the American government, giving a sense of how things that were going on within the German, aka Nazi scientific community. The job was a bit of an anticlimax ultimately, because what he was constantly finding is that he was proving a negative. There probably wasn't a progressing German bomb program, but the highlight, I would say, of his espionage career comes in 1944 in a Zurich lecture hall, where the person who was the theoretical physicist who would have been the leader of the whatever German atomic bomb program there was, a physicist named Werner Heisenberg, when Heisenberg comes to give a lecture on something completely unrelated to atomic weapons, Berg is sitting in that lecture with a pistol in his pocket and also a lethal cyanide pill. And he's trying to decide whether or not he should assassinate Heisenberg to thwart this growing German atomic bomb program. He decides not to, but the information that he was accumulating was really good information. It just wasn't quite saving the day, so to speak. He wasn't, uncovering a great menace and thwarting that menace. And this becomes, in many ways, a thematic point in his life, which suggests a lot about his character, that he always felt in some way that he was coming up short, even though he was sort of part Babe Ruth, part James Bond in a certain way. He really was a member of Major League Baseball, an elite, sort of fraternity of people. And he was a member of professional espionage, and he was a better spy than baseball player. So he did these remarkable things. It's just that for some people, there is this desire to mythologize them even more. And that's, I think, something we get onto a bit later. One of the things I sensed is that with Moe Berg, there was always a desire for there to be more. And for me, the more, and actually the most compelling and human part of his story is what becomes of his life after he comes back from the war, when he is now, and once the OSS sort of disbands and becomes the CIA. And I think it would have been Moe Berg's dear wish to work for the CIA for the rest of his life. And he did a couple of contract assignments for them. But by and large, the CIA was displeased with his work, and they didn't extend any more work to him. What then happens is, to me, something very poignant, which is that Moe Berg continues to live as he had in Latin America, as he had as a Major League Baseball player, and as he had as an intelligence operative, which is to say that he moves from place to place, staying somewhere for a few days, wearing his Moe Berg uniform, continuing to go to museums, to meet up with people, to have long conversations, and then he's gone. And nobody really knows where he lives, what he's doing, what his source of income is. But everywhere he goes, he's charming people. A good spy doesn't call attention to himself. A good spy is someone who is there and kind of not there, who is a benign presence. Moe Berg was someone who had qualities of a good spy, with his interest in language, with his great worldly knowledge and so forth, but he also did like to call attention to himself. And so there was this way that he was sort of behaving like a spy, but it's more like a spy manqué, I guess you would say. And so as he goes from place to place, meeting sometimes physicists, he spent 6 weeks living in Joe DiMaggio's hotel room in New York. He would go to see Einstein in Princeton. He knew a glittering array of people. And then he also knew people that you wouldn't have heard of, but who were truly compelling people. The people he associated with, generally, it was a lot of fun to write this book, in part because there were so many people who were so, they were wonderful to talk to about this man and his life and what it meant, right? But what's he doing? What's going on with him? Why is he one day in Canada, the next day in Philadelphia, another day he's out in Oklahoma, and then he's in Joe DiMaggio's hotel room, and then he's here, there, and gone, and what did it really mean? And also, as a writer, it becomes a problem. How do you write about this? Because what we discussed up until now was kind of a linear narrative of sort of childhood, academic preparation, and then a sequence of career, right? But suddenly there's no more career, and he's moving around in this itinerant way, and that's most of the rest of his life. So how do you handle that as a writer? And that, for me, was also a great thinking about structure, thinking about what you would do with this was for me, very exciting to think about as a problem for a writer.
I mean, in the reading, I mean, you talked about it in an energetic way. And, in reading the book, like, who knows what was going on inside of Moe Berg's head, right? But it struck me as sad, basically, right? Like, he seems sort of at sea. I mean, I don't know if he was sad, but that was how it seemed to me for a long time, right? His life goes on for decades after the war. And as far as we know, he doesn't seem to have any enduring, intimate relationships in the traditional sense. He never really lives anywhere. He's sort of living on the myths of his youth, as many people do to a lesser degree, but that sort of seems like all he's got. I mean, is that a fair characterization?
I think that's all fair. I think that life for a lot of people is sad. And there's more sadness and there's more sorrow than there is happiness. But I also think that the fact that he lived this fleeting, peripatetic, to some degree, ephemeral existence is true, but it doesn't notice something that I came to think about him, which was how creative he was. That he found he didn't live in a conventional way. He invented a way to live. And he invented a way to live that replicated a way to live that really made him happy when he was younger. The baseball existence made him really happy. The existence as an intelligence agent made him really happy. If you can't do those things anymore, I mean, one of the things that you hear all the time from former athletes is this sense of mortality, right? This sense of something that they dedicate their whole lives to that ends in either their early to mid, and for the luckiest, late 30s. Then what comes afterwards? And that's especially a question now, since most professional athletes make enough money they don't have to work. In the old days, Carl Erskine would pitch for the Dodgers, and then he had a job working in a bank back in Indiana, right? Well, this doesn't necessarily happen anymore. So people can be a little bit at sea. This is a lot of people, actually. And I think that what was so interesting about Moe Berg is that he invented a life, A, that suited him, and B, was distinctive. It wasn't a life in the way that other people lived it, but it was a life that took into account the ways of existence that made him comfortable: newspapers, clothing, travel, series of brief encounters with different people. I notice also that it's sort of a, that he was such a star on that talk show, Information Please, really interests me because it has an information please kind of 30 minutes where you're really on and then you're off for a while. It provided an opportunity and he provided also a lot of happiness to other people. Wherever he went, people were glad to see him. They were glad to take him in. He paid for his time as their guest by being incredibly entertaining. Nobody forgot Moe Berg. And that's not something that you can say about a lot of people. Also, I just also think that for people who really struggle in life, and I thought about this personally, I thought about it in relation to my own father, who had lots of struggles too. I thought that it was an important thing to write about and write about honorably, because clearly there was something wrong. Whatever his struggles were, he became increasingly, what can we say? I mean, somebody who won't let other people touch his newspapers, who wears the same clothes every day. There's a thin line between eccentricity and compulsion, right? And I think that there were times where his life had real struggle. And I think that those are worthy subjects to be written about. And I think that it's people who capture other people's imagination for other things that allow you to see, that sort of function as a lens where you can see into the nature of struggle. And I felt glad that Moe Berg gave me a chance to write about some things, even obliquely, that are difficult and poignant in people, the things that we usually might read about in fiction, particularly Russian fiction, I would like to say. But yeah.
Maybe the last thing for me, it's striking to me that you wrote this book when you were, did you say in your mid-20s? Is that right? Can that be so?
I started writing it in my mid-20s. I think it came out right around when I was 30.
Yeah, and now you are not in your mid-20s or even 30, right?
No.
And so, I mean, particularly because of the nature of his life, as you were describing, and he did so much as a young man, and in a conventional sense, at least, not so much after that, right? When you look at the story now, at 50-ish, does it feel different to you? Or do you feel like you have new insights into it than you did when you wrote the book as a much younger man?
You can't write about a secretive person without a lot of people helping you, especially a secretive person who went from place to place, who never stayed anywhere very long. The project required a great deal of what we might call pick and shovel work, that's what writers sometimes call this, which is, this before the internet. So how do I get in touch? I tried to get in touch with everybody who'd ever been Moe Berg's teammate, anybody who'd ever known him. I placed ads in publications and things, but I also got a lot of help from people who had real insight into particular aspects of his life. One of them, for example, was a former CIA director who decided that even though I couldn't see, they just don't allow people to see people's CIA file. He allowed me to sit with a CIA staff psychologist who had the file in front of him. And he allowed me to, in effect, interview this man about Moe Berg. So another person who I couldn't have done this without was Thomas Powers, who's a wonderful nonfiction writer who's about a generation older than I, who was writing a book called Heisenberg's War. And he had written earlier a book called The Man Who Kept the Secrets, which was considered at that point the definitive history of the CIA. It was the story of Richard Helms, but it was really about the CIA. And Tom Powers invited me to his house, and he opened his files to me, and he told me how to look at them. And when I spent months and months and months in the National Archives looking at the OSS archives and things, if I found something, here was someone who I could tell about my little victory. Here's what Alan Dulles said about Moe Berg, that he's like an opera singer, all sorts of, when I'd have those victories, it was incredibly helpful. And it was also reassuring to have this more experienced older person who was in effect telling me whether I was, thinking about things in a reasonable way. Tom Powers said to me, I'll never forget this at one point, he was saying my first book was going to come out, and, I had been paid very little for this book. I'd given up my job to do this. I didn't know where my life was going to go. And I was not Moe Berg. That kind of existence would have terrified me. I had a father who didn't, provide for his family. I mean, all these things were very scary. And he said, you've done this. You never know where a book's going to go. You never know how it's going to live. No one can say. But here's one thing that will happen. Sooner or later, you'll be somewhere. Maybe you'll be in an inn somewhere, or you'll be in someone's house, and you'll look down and there'll be a copy of your book, and it will be, on a shelf or on a side table or something like that. And you'll say, huh. And you won't have looked at it in a really long time. And then you'll pick it up and you'll start thumbing through it, and you'll say, not bad. I did my best, and I think that that's true. I mean, naturally, as you go through life, you become more experienced as a writer and as a person, and you have different feelings and thoughts about a subject, especially such a complicated subject. But I guess that's what I would say about it.
That's a lovely, I won't quite call it a kicker, but it's a lovely thought. Olivia, why don't I pass it back to you?
Terrific. What a conversation. Wow. I was struggling to keep up with just the flow of information coming from the both of you. Right now, I just want to briefly tell our audience about upcoming programs, and then we'll get to the very interesting audience questions. So next Sunday, October 24th, we're doing a program in collaboration with the Anne Frank Center in New York, and I've been wanting to do this for a very long time. Since our series here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, well, in our foundation, we honor an important rescuer, Sousa Mendes, Aristides Sousa Mendes. And this series we've been having on Sundays has to do with rescue and resistance. So next Sunday, we're focusing on the rescuer of the Frank family. Her name was Miep Gies. And we're offering a book. We're going to show you the cover of the book. And I do encourage you to order it for Hanukkah or for a birthday of a young person in your life. It's quite a lovely read. It's by an author named Meeg Pincus. So Meeg will be our guest along with Gillian Perry, who is the founder of the Anne Frank Center in the United Kingdom. So I do encourage you to sign up for that program next week. The program is free, and books are $18, signed and inscribed by the author. The following week, we are turning to the 1936 Berlin Olympics and putting a spotlight on Jesse Owens, who was the person who personified the defeat of Hitler in his own Olympics. This myth of Aryan supremacy. Well, Jesse Owens was the hero, an African-American runner of that Olympics. And we're graced with the presence of Jesse Owens' grandson, who will be with us. We also have a member of the International Olympic Committee, Anita DeFrance. She was a US Olympic medalist, and she's vice president of the International Olympic Committee. She will be on our panel as well. And we have Lori Weintraub, historian and director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center, will be speaking in general terms about that Olympics. And that is also a free program. In 3 weeks' time, which brings us into November 7th, we're focusing on the roots of the state of Israel, and in particular on the figure of Theodor Herzl, who died 50 years before Israel existed, having foreseen that the Jews of Europe were sitting on a volcano that was about to explode. And this is amazing prophecy on his part. So we're focusing on his figure. We are showing a film, a very interesting film called My Herzl, which profiles a Canadian collector of Herzl memorabilia. So we're having that collector, David Matlow, on our program as our guest, as well as Derek Penzlar, who is Herzl's biographer, and Shulamit Reinhardt, who's a sociologist at Brandeis University. And that program, just like today's program, will have tickets associated with it. We do propose the price of 18 or high, but if you can give more, that's wonderful. Or if it's a hardship, just give whatever is comfortable for you, and we'll be delighted to have you. So now let's turn to your questions. So the first question is, why did Moe Bergs show the film to the Office of Strategic Studies? Was he already involved with that office?
Thank you for the question. I think that my sense is that he enjoyed showing it to people, and that he thought that he had something perhaps a little bit more unique than was true. I don't think that he was aware of just the number of people who worked for the American government who'd been studying Japan and who'd been there. So he thought that he thought that he had something rarer than in fact that it was, which isn't to say that what he did wasn't a great thing to have done. I would also like to just say about it, though, that it also speaks to a kind of an element of his personality, which is that, like many people, he was susceptible to flattery, and this was something that people picked up on. And throughout his life, he often will tell people things that others have said about him, and then you would find out from the others who said them that they were sort of acting on cues from him. And I think one of the reasons that story exists is because people wanted Moe Berg to feel that what he had done was very impressive, which it was, and that it was very important. And maybe he exaggerated just a little bit its own importance. He was tormented by his desire to be important. And I feel quite sure that a lot of this has to do with a father who was really, really nasty to him. And he made fun of him as a baseball player. He mocked him. He mocked his interest in languages. Some of the letters I found from his father to him were the things that no son would ever want to receive from a parent. And that, I think, I mean, it's, you shouldn't psychoanalyze too much just from your armchair, but I would say that this was a person then whose accomplishments always needed to be more of an accomplishment, perhaps, than they actually were. The sufficient accomplishment never seemed to be enough. And one way you can see this is that I found a series of pages that Moe Berg wrote across the latter stages of his life, where he outlined his own autobiography over and over and over. And it was always a really inchoate effort. In other words, he started writing it, and there would be a sentence, a paragraph, and then a sentence, and then a phrase. And it really, for me, it was kind of heartbreaking the way it would begin as something firm and clear and in sort of very bold ink, and then it would slowly decline almost into nothing. And I found in that it seemed profound, and I find in all these major moments of his, which have been somewhat distorted, I think that all of this has to do with it.
So there's a question about a scene in the movie. I don't know if it's true, but there was this conversation between him and a man in Japan where they talk about the fact that they likely will never see each other after the war. So was that a real person? Did that conversation happen? Did they see each other again?
I think that probably, I can't speak to, exactly what the screenwriter had in mind. There is a real person from who Berg became close to in Japan, who was a teacher in Japan, and they became very good friends. And Moe Berg's sexuality is something that was much debated among baseball players and later on in life. And this was, of course, a time when homosexuality wasn't something that most people talked about openly. And so there's lots of speculations during Moe Berg's life and since about whether he was gay or whether he was bisexual or whether he had many sexual relationships with women. He had only, that I was able to discover, one really close relationship with a woman. I don't know what it all means, but there were definitely letters that I found that Berg kept, in which people said, I wish you'd stayed with me. A man in particular said, I wish you'd stayed with me, and what could have been, and things like that. But it was all very cryptic. I guess I just want to say about the script of the film. Any writer would be thrilled to have their book made into a film. And I think it would be a very unrealistic writer who expected their version of the story to become the film version of the story. And many, many people tried to make a film about Moe Berg before this film was made. I heard from all kinds of people. I mentioned Nathan Lane, which would have been actually for Broadway, but like David Mamet wanted to meet and discuss the possibility of making a film about Moe Berg, which would be quite different from whatever Nathan Lane made, right? Which would be quite different from when George Clooney and Steven Soderbergh, were interested in making a film. There were a lot of different ways to do it. If you'd, I never had any interest in writing a film myself because I felt I'd already told this story and it was now for somebody else. But if I'd done it, the films, I should say, that felt truest to my own feelings about Moe Berg were films like The Third Man and Citizen Kane, which are stories in which a very complicated person who there seem to be hidden truths are slowly revealed by someone who's sort of investigating the life, so to speak.
So that would have been you. You would have been the star of the
I
movie.
wouldn't have thought, if I were writing it, it did seem self-serving, I admit, but I didn't really think of it in terms of me. I just thought that would be a way to solve the problem of the episodic nature of the life and of the mystery. And that it would be
the anticlimax, right? As you said, it seems like in a way the standard narrative of his life builds to this moment when he's in the room with Heisenberg. And his decision is essentially to do nothing, which is, probably the right decision, but in a narrative sense, it makes for a hard movie, right?
Right, you're absolutely right. And what I would like to say, for example, about The Third Man is that the person who's finding out about Harry Lime, the Orson Welles character, who doesn't even appear for much of the time, he's just somebody who's of significant reputation, you're getting the parallel, much more emotional narrative of this other person. So it became, I thought, a way to take a little bit of the pressure off of someone who, in a funny way, could be the most dynamic figure, but also a sort of a supporting actor. To me, that just seemed structurally and technically a more likely narrative technique for the problem that you're exactly beautifully defining.
Why did Moe Berg decline the Presidential Medal of Freedom?
I think, he didn't ever really say, but people who would probably know, who would speculate, said that he felt really rejected. First, he felt rejected just by the OSS disbanding and being reconstituted as the CIA. And this really hurt him because he felt he loved the organization and he loved the life that it afforded him. But then I think there was a strong sense of rejection when the CIA basically didn't want him. And so that always seemed to me to be but it's also just the complication that I hope I alluded to sufficiently earlier with his relationship to success, that here is a talisman of success, right? And that he rejects it. To me, this just suggests the incredible core ambivalence in this person. And I just find it, given all the other things that we've been discussing, it's moving, right?
Say that the thing you just said, like the ambivalence towards success, I don't think I quite understand that. What do you mean by that?
I mean, here's someone who's attracted to American institutions at the highest levels, prestigious elite universities. He starts out at NYU, a perfectly wonderful university. My grandmother went to NYU right around that time. And he will never mention it. He will only ever talk about Princeton.
There's something. The Presidential Medal of Freedom is Princeton. It is a high status thing.
I know. I mean, this is why I think that once there's on one level someone who is often trying to convince people of his stature and his eminence and the substance of the things that he does. And then it's, to me anyway, very human and very, again, sort of poignant that when finally what all this effort that is going into what can we say, a little bit of self-promotion, right? That when you have something tangible that is just right there, that it's rejected. I don't know. To me, that's why he's one of the many reasons why he was such a beautiful subject for whom I'm so grateful. It's just because of this human complication that I think ultimately, who cares if he wasn't the greatest baseball player? He was somebody who lived in such an original way that revealed such, to me anyway, such deeper human complication and truth. To me, as a writer, that was much more exciting. And there's no scene like that Heisenberg scene, right? That Heisenberg scene, there's nothing like it.
So there's a scene in the movie, of course, that takes place around the chessboard. So is that fact or fiction? And did Moe Berg play chess? And did he play it at a high level?
If he did, I don't know anything about it.
So that's all made up.
Or maybe I mean, the screenwriter and I never discussed chess, and I don't remember anything about chess. Remember, I wrote this book a long time ago, so maybe I've forgotten something, but it certainly wasn't in any way at the center of his life.
You can say it's made up.
I think it was made. I don't want to say it.
So let's see. There are other questions. Let me grab some more.
He did, while you're looking, I'll mention, I mean, he did have a photographic memory, right? There's the one piece of the chess thing that made me think of the book was, you said he could like look at somebody could show him a text and take it away and he could tell them what it said, right? I mean, that's
right.
like.
That's right. Yep. I mean, there are so many interesting things about him. I mean, you know,
there's something sort of spectrum-y about him. I mean, that was a question that arose. I mean, I know he was, well, let me just ask it. Like, obviously, we're sort of projecting onto the past this idea of a spectrum, you know, an autism spectrum of Asperger's that was not really in effect then. But like, do you think about that when you think about him?
I mean, I guess one of the things that, I mean, when you ask the question, the phrase that comes into my mind is that he wasn't always in control of himself. If you, for example, if you think about his interactions with women really, really liked him. Most people really liked him. But one of the things that recurred increasingly as he got older too, is that in his interactions, he sometimes behaved in ways that showed absolutely no understanding of his effect on them. And that he did things that other people found stunningly inappropriate at times. And so there was this sense, I mean, the way he dresses and all his rituals, that's deep control, right? But then there are also these conflicting impulses that are really out of control. And it wouldn't be for me to offer diagnosis per se, but I remember talking to people about it. And I remember talking to that, for example, that CIA staff psychiatrist. And I mean, this was something certainly people thought about, that whatever was going on was complex and sometimes people were troubled by it, sure.
Was there any evidence that perhaps Moe Berg was working for the Jewish Agency? It was before the State of Israel, but there was the Jewish Agency because he was moving around so much. Did he have any connection with them?
That I've never heard anything like that. You know, I mean, given the way that he was raised, one thing I'll just say a couple of quick things about Moe Berg and Judaism. It's like, here's Moe Berg. When Moe Berg is with a bunch of physicists, he's always the baseball player. When Moe Berg is with former baseball players, he's always the person who is the intellectual, who he's always in a way the other. And one of the things that I just noticed is that, and yet he's trying to fit in, right? I mean, he seems to choose professions that, among other things, rely on uniforms, right? So there are these tensions that are always going on. And in terms of Judaism, you know, I mean, I'll just tell you something there's so many features of a man's life. We couldn't possibly address them all here. But one thing I think you might find interesting is that when he's at Princeton, he's invited to join an eating club. But he said, we'd love you to come and join our eating club as long as you don't try and ask us to recruit other Jews. And he refuses, and he goes out of town, so he doesn't even have to talk to them in the important moment when it will be decided who joins. And I think he had a lot of integrity in that way. And I think that, you know, as someone who walked in realms of the country and the world where there weren't many Jewish people, he was always conscious that he was conspicuous, and sometimes he was and sometimes he wasn't. But it was something, you know, he knew how to read Hebrew, you know, and although his father had banned Yiddish from the home, he didn't just know a lot of Yiddish words, he knew a lot about sort of linguistics of Hebrew words and Yiddish words. And I mean, what can I say? Like everything else in his life, it was something of absorbing interest to him, and at times a preoccupation, and other times something that his ambivalence made him just sort of not want to be associated with. You know, for a lot of Jewish people in his time, there was great hope that he would be, you know, a great star. But he was a great star in the sense that Hank Greenberg was the great Jewish baseball player. He was the superstar Hall of Fame baseball player, the colossal slugger. Moe Berg was of great significance in his time to a lot of people because he showed that you could do both. You could both have a life of the mind and you could have fun and play sports and do things that a lot of American boys did.
Well, this hour has just flown by, and I wanted to give my profound thanks to both Nicholas Dawidoff and Jacob Goldstein. And to our audience, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you next week. And so see you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Be well.